It is the summer of 1888. The American Southwest. A remote Zuni village in what will one day become New Mexico. A woman is crouched beside an ancient stone structure, carefully sketching its dimensions by hand. She has been doing this for 9 years. She speaks the Zuni language. She knows the names of the ceremonial objects on these shelves, the histories behind them, the generation of builders who shaped each room. She has documented more of ancient America than almost any researcher alive. Her husband has just died. And the message from Washington arrives within weeks. The Smithsonian Institution wants her to come home. She does not go home. She stays. She keeps working. She spends the next 27 years completing the most detailed record of ancient southwestern civilization ever produced in the 19th century, a record that still sits in the Smithsonian's archives today. Her name was Matilda Coxe Stevenson. She is documented in the Bureau of American Ethnology's own annual reports from 1880 onward. Her monograph, The Zuni Indians, published in 1904, ran to nearly 700 pages and is still referenced by archaeologists today. Almost nobody has heard of her. How does the most important female archaeologist of the 19th century disappear from the history books while the institution she worked for kept every page she ever wrote? That is what this investigation is about. To understand what Matilda Stevenson accomplished, we need to understand what America looked like in 1879. The American Southwest was not yet mapped in any meaningful sense. There were no roads through much of New Mexico and Arizona. The ancient ruins scattered across the landscape stone structures, cliff dwellings, underground ceremonial chambers called kivas, had been observed by explorers and soldiers, but no one had ever systematically studied them. No one had recorded who built them, how they were constructed, what they contained, or how they connected to the living native communities nearby. The federal government's Bureau of American Ethnology, housed within the Smithsonian Institution, had just been created for exactly this purpose, and in 1879 it sent its first official expedition to the Southwest. James Stevenson led that expedition. His wife Matilda came with him. On paper, she was there as a companion. That was the only category available to a woman joining a federal scientific expedition in 1879. In practice, something else happened immediately. The moment the expedition reached Zuni Pueblo, Matilda Stevenson began doing something none of the male researchers could do. She walked into the parts of Zuni society that were closed to men. In Zuni culture, and in many Pueblo communities there, were ceremonies, spaces, and social structures that women could access and men could not. Every male ethnographer before Stevenson had described Zuni society from the outside. She was the first researcher to enter from the inside. Within weeks, she had been given a Zuni name. Within months, she was documenting ceremonies that no outside observer had ever witnessed. She recorded the materials used in ceremonial objects, the songs performed during rituals, the social organization of clans, the agricultural methods passed through generations, the astronomical knowledge encoded into the layout of the village itself. She did this with a pencil and a notebook, in temperatures that reached 100 degrees in summer and dropped below freezing in winter, living in conditions that most Washington officials had never experienced and could barely imagine. The Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology annual report for 1881 includes a section crediting Matilda Stevenson with the collection of ceremonial objects and the documentation of Zuni social organization. It is one of the few times her contribution was formally credited during her lifetime, and here is where the story becomes complicated. Because for most of the next 9 years, while Matilda Stevenson was doing the actual field work, the interviews, the sketches, the object catalogues, the language recordings, the published reports, listed her husband James as the lead researcher. That was simply how it worked. In 1880s America, a woman could produce the research. she could not own it. So what happens when the man whose name appears on the reports is suddenly gone? James Stevenson died in July 1888. Rocky Mountain spotted fever. He was 52 years old. They had been working together in the Southwest for 9 years. The expedition notes, the artifact catalogues, the field photographs, the years of relationship building with Zuni and Hopi communities, all of it had been a joint effort. Only one of them had been credited in the reports. And now, the other one was dead. The Bureau of American Ethnology was run by John Wesley Powell, the same man who had made the first documented boat journey down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. Powell understood field research. He had respect for people who could survive in difficult terrain and produce useful science. But Powell also ran a federal institution in 1888 Washington, and in 1888 Washington. The idea of a woman leading a scientific expedition without a male supervisor was genuinely controversial. There was no formal category for it, no precedent. Matilda Stevenson did not ask permission. She wrote to Powell and told him she intended to continue the work. She proposed a formal appointment as an ethnologist with the Bureau. She listed her qualifications: 9 years of field experience. Fluency in Zuni. A documented collection of several thousand objects. First-hand access to ceremonies no male researcher had witnessed. The Smithsonian archives contain her correspondence from this period. Her letters are precise, confident, and detailed. She does not apologize for being a woman asking for a professional position. She simply presents the evidence of her work. Powell approved the appointment. She became one of the first women formally employed as a scientist by the Smithsonian Institution. And then the real resistance began. It did not come from Powell. It came from her colleagues. The male ethnographers of the Bureau of American Ethnology did not know quite what to do with Matilda Stevenson. She was older than some of them. She had more field experience than most of them. She could go places they could not. And she was not deferential. Contemporary accounts describe her as formidable, direct, willing to argue, unwilling to minimize her own findings to make male colleagues comfortable. Frank Hamilton Cushing, one of the most famous ethnographers of the era, known for his years living among the Zuni, had a relationship with Stevenson that archival letters describe as almost openly hostile. He had his own claims to Zuni expertise. She had hers, and her access was in some respects deeper than his, because she could enter the parts of Zuni society he could not. Here is the thing historians keep coming back to. If two researchers are studying the same community, and one of them can only study half of it, which one produces the more complete record? Matilda Stevenson produced the more complete record, and the institution spent decades organizing itself as though the other researchers' work was the definitive version. But the documents she left behind do not disappear. Between 1888 and 1904, she completed work that modern archaeologists still rely on. She documented the Zuni Pueblo, a community whose ceremonial traditions had never been recorded in a monograph published by the Bureau in 1894. She continued her Zuni research through 7 more field seasons. She photographed ruins. She mapped structures. She recorded songs in phonetic notation, objects in measured drawings, social systems in organizational charts that would not look out of place in a modern anthropological study. She also did something that separated her from almost every contemporary. She took the time to record what the native communities themselves said about their own history. In the 1880s and 1890s, this was not standard practice. Most ethnographers of the period documented what they observed and interpreted it through their own cultural framework. Stevenson was not perfect, no researcher of that era was, and some of her interpretations reflect the biases of her time, but she understood that the people she was studying were the primary experts on their own history. The Zuni elders called her Wa Tsitsi, roughly translated as Little Mother. That name, documented in her own field notes, tells you something about the relationship she built over 27 years. It is not the name you give someone you merely tolerate. Her 1904 monograph, The Zuni Indians, was published by the Bureau of American Ethnology as part of their annual report series. It runs to 634 pages. It includes photographs, maps, ceremonial object descriptions, kinship charts, and a detailed account of Zuni cosmology as explained by Zuni knowledge keepers. It is one of the most comprehensive documents of any indigenous community produced in the 19th century. It was published 25 years after her first field season, and within a generation of its publication, almost nobody outside academic circles could name its author. Here is where this story becomes stranger than most people realize. It is not just that Matilda Stevenson's name disappeared from popular history. That happens to many researchers. Time passes. Textbooks simplify. Names get dropped. What makes her case different is this. The institution that held all her work, the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology, was also the institution that spent decades promoting the names of male researchers who had worked the same region, studied the same communities, and in several cases produced less comprehensive documentation. John Wesley Powell, who ran the Bureau, is remembered today as one of the great figures of American exploration. Statues, named landmarks, history textbooks. Frank Hamilton Cushing, who lived among the Zuni and wrote about his experience in popular magazine articles, became famous during his lifetime. His name appears in virtually every history of Southwestern archaeology. Matilda Stevenson documented more, went deeper, spent more years, produced more pages, and published her major work later, by which point the popular narrative of who had discovered the ancient Southwest had already been written, without her in it. How does this happen? The answer is not dramatic. It does not require a conspiracy. It requires something much more ordinary. It requires a system that decides, quietly and consistently, whose work gets promoted in public lectures, whose name gets cited in newspaper articles, whose photograph ends up on the cover of popular magazines, and whose name appears only in the footnotes of academic monographs that most people never read. That system did not need to actively erase Matilda Stevenson. It simply needed to look elsewhere, repeatedly for decades. And it did. The archival record of Stevenson's later years is not comfortable reading. By the 1890s, she was fighting on multiple fronts. She was defending her field access against colleagues who questioned whether a woman should be conducting independent research. She was arguing for publication of her Zuni monograph, a process that took years longer than comparable male-authored works. She was dealing with the bureaucratic machinery of a federal institution that had no established path for a woman in her position. And she was still going to New Mexico, every year, still doing the field work. One documented incident captures the situation precisely. In 1893, Stevenson attended the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the same World's Fair we now know as the White City. The Smithsonian had a major exhibition there. Artifacts she had collected from Zuni and Sia were on display. The exhibition catalogue credited the Bureau of American Ethnology. Her name did not appear on the labels. She wrote to her supervisors about it. The correspondence is in the Smithsonian archives. Her tone in those letters is controlled, but the frustration is unmistakable. She had spent 14 years collecting these objects. She had documented their ceremonial significance. She had negotiated with community members to allow their display. And the public face of the exhibition made it appear as though they had appeared in Washington by some institutional process entirely disconnected from any individual researcher. The Smithsonian Institution archives contain correspondence files for Matilda Coxe Stevenson spanning 1881 to 1914. These files include her letters to Powell and his successors, field reports, budget requests, and documentation of disputes with colleagues. They are publicly accessible. They have been consulted by historians studying the history of women in American science. What they reveal is a researcher who spent 35 years producing first-rate science inside an institution that consistently gave the public credit to someone else. There is one more dimension to this story that most popular accounts leave out. Matilda Stevenson was not simply documenting ruins as physical structures. She was documenting living cultural traditions that connected directly to those ancient sites. When she mapped an ancient kiva, the underground ceremonial chamber that appears in pueblo after pueblo across the southwest, she did not just measure its dimensions. She recorded what ceremonies were still performed in equivalent spaces. She documented the objects used, the songs sung, the social relationships between the people who participated. In doing so, she created something that no photograph of a ruin could create alone. She created a bridge between the stone evidence on the ground and the living memory of the people whose ancestors had built those stones. That bridge is what archaeologists call ethnographic analogy, using the documented practices of living communities to help interpret ancient physical evidence. It is a standard tool of modern archaeology. Stevenson was doing it in the 1880s, without a name for the method, without a textbook to follow, with nothing but her own intelligence and the access she had built over years of patient, respectful fieldwork. So here is the question that modern archaeologists keep returning to. How much of what we know about ancient America, the interpretation of ruins, the reconstruction of ancient ceremonies, the understanding of social organization in pre-contact southwestern communities, how much of that actually traces back to Matilda Stevenson's work, filtered through decades of subsequent research that no longer names its original source? The honest answer is probably more than we can calculate. Because when you build a bridge and someone else uses it for 100 years without acknowledging who built it, eventually the bridge just becomes part of the landscape. Matilda Coxe Stevenson died in June 1915. She was 65 years old. She was still employed by the Smithsonian. She had been working on a follow-up study of Zuni ceremonial practices, a project that remained unfinished at her death. Her papers went into the archives. Her objects, thousands of them, collected over 35 years of fieldwork, remained in the Smithsonian's collections. Many are still there. Her monographs remained in print in academic catalogues. And for most of the 20th century, that was essentially where the story ended. The material survived. The name did not travel far beyond specialist circles. The modern reassessment of Stevenson's work began in earnest in the 1980s and 1990s, as historians of science started examining the systematic patterns by which women's contributions to 19th century American science had been minimized. Her name appears in several academic studies from this period. Her correspondence at the Smithsonian Archives began receiving more scholarly attention. Today, archaeologists and anthropologists who specialize in the ancient Southwest know her name. Her Zuni monograph is cited in peer-reviewed research. Her photographs are referenced in studies of Southwestern material culture. But, outside academic circles, type her name into a search engine and see what you find. Then type the names of her male contemporaries who produced less. The difference in those search results is not about the quality of the work. There is a final detail in this story that deserves to be said directly. The ancient ruins that Matilda Stevenson helped document, the stone structures at Zuni, the kivas at Pueblo, the ceremonial objects she catalogued and measured, these are not curiosities from a vanished people. The Zuni nation is still here. The Hopi are still here. The Pueblo peoples whose ancestors built those structures have never left. Their cultural traditions, many of which Stevenson documented when no one else was asking, continue today. Any honest investigation of what she accomplished has to hold both of those truths at once. She did work that was genuinely important. She did it in a way that respected, at least by the standards of her era, the communities she was studying. And she was written out of the popular version of history by a system that simply was not designed to keep her name visible. That system has changed, not completely, but more than it once was. There is a photograph in the Smithsonian archives, a field photograph from one of Stevenson's expeditions, a woman in practical field clothes standing at the edge of an ancient structure. Behind her, stone walls. Ahead of her, desert horizon. Nobody wrote her name on the back of the photograph. For a long time, that seemed like the end of the story, but the archive kept the photograph, and the archive kept the notebooks, and the archive kept the letters. Sometimes history does not disappear. Sometimes it just waits for someone to go back and read what was actually written down. Thank you for watching the Vertical Archive. If you found this investigation worthwhile, subscribe, because next week we follow another documented chapter of American history that was left out of the textbooks. Not because the evidence was hidden, but because no one thought to go back and look. Until now.